At the end of 1914, the Western Front on the First World War had come to a standstill, and trench warfare became the norm. Though all powers were hastily searching for technological advantages over their enemy, in the United Kingdom the idea of landships was explored, to break through the stagnant trench borders. Step by step, the idea of assembling rotating turrets onto armoured vehicles, supported by undercarriages with a caterpillar-like construction, was conceived. The tank, slowly but surely, was born. The development of the invulnerable, sealed war machine was originally the idea of Leonardo da Vinci, but it only became a potential reality once the internal combustion engine was developed. The British were a bit short-sighted in the development and usage of tanks during the First World War. The fact that the development of the tank was realized in the first place, even though there was much opposition within Britain, was thanks to Colonel Ernest Swinton. Swinton attempted to unite the advantages of tractors with armoured vehicles. He shared his ideas with Winston Churchill, who was at that time First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill was fond of this idea and encouraged the development of tanks, then referred to as His Majesty's Landships, funding it with Admiralty funds. After all, the Ministry of War made it known they weren't interested in the development of these landships. Designing what would become known as the tank wasn't completely a revolutionary idea. Before the First World War, the military of various countries had advocated the development of armoured vehicles as manpower was being replaced by innovations in the technical and chemical sector. Think of poison gas and the Maxim gun. In the 18th century, the forerunners of caterpillar tracks had been anticipated by Richard Edgeworth, but while he played around with the idea for decades, he never developed it. 60 years before the First World War, during the Crimean War, tractors supported by dreadnought wheels and steam engines were already in use, but that was about it. There were massive costs attached to the development of actual usable tanks, and the need for them wasn't that obvious until the bloodshed and carnage of the First World War. With the support of Churchill, an opposite idea was to saw open a submarine and to construct caterpillar tracks under it. An entire platoon of officers could, in one go, break through enemy lines. Another idea could be compared to a motorized medieval siege tower, 50 meters in height, 30 meters in length, and 3 massive wheels with over 300 tons of weight. These ideas to show something different, besides their absurdity in hindsight. The first tank relied on transporting manpower, and not so much being the dominant firepower force we have come to know it as. There were multiple ideas, and as absurd as these ideas seem, all of them contributed to the creation of something that eventually did work. So basically, the people in charge of coming up with tank designs ran two different trains of thought. One was concerned with the movement of soldiers, devising a machine that could safely transport entire platoons, whereas the other was concerned with designing something that had firepower and was mobile in order to support and cover soldiers. Eventually, the idea of placing turrets onto armoured vehicles supported by undercarriages with caterpillar tracks was tested. An actual working landship was coming closer, though the British designs didn't have a rotatable turret yet. The first tank to have one was the French Renault FT tank. The French were designing their own type of tanks at the same time as the British, though intelligence wasn't shared between the countries. Under the supervision of the General Jean-Baptiste Eugène Estienne, Renault developed one of the first prototype tanks as they would become known to men. This tank was finished in 1917 and was preceded by two other tanks, the Schneider and the Saint-Chamond, both designs struggling with their own malfunctions, inadequacies, and honestly their use was more or less a disappointment. They couldn't cross trenches, among other things. The development of the British Landship predated the development of these Renault tanks, and funnily enough, under supervision of the British Navy instead of the Army. So I've already touched upon why the Navy was developing a landship. And it was because Winston Churchill, as would become characteristic for large parts of his career, was dead set on his goal and wouldn't listen to anyone telling him he was wasting his time and money. The entire project was regulated by the War Office, and eventually it was agreed upon that instead of putting the focus on moving soldiers, developing mobile firepower would be the primary focus. The first serious tank design was named Little Willie. It was a square steel box supported by a caterpillar undercarriage. It started to look like a tank, but the main downside was that it was too short, causing instability because the length-height ratio wasn't correct. Little Willie wouldn't manage to pass the trenches and never saw combat because of that. After all, the main task of these vehicles was to be able to cross over the 1.5-meter trenches. Still, major improvements towards the first usable tank were made during its development. Lieutenant Walter Gordon Wilson, an officer of the Armored Car Division, figured that supporting an entire vehicle with tracks around its main body instead of just having an undercarriage with caterpillar tracks was the way to go. By having the entire body of the vehicle circumferenced with tracks, it would be able to climb gaps and trenches without falling into it. Mark I, or the HMLS Centipede, or Mother, was born, albeit in theory. The brainstorming had taken up to 11 months and it had to be operated by 4 men. But once the prototype was developed in January 1916 and showcased to the military command, and King George V, Minister of War Lord Horatio Kitchener remarked, "It is a pretty mechanical toy, but without serious military value." Regardless of Kitchener's criticism, in February, the first 100 tanks were ordered. Time, or rather the lack thereof, was crucial in the development of the tank. Time pressure was enormous, as the First World War kept waging on, and at the end of February, the Germans launched their Verdun offensive. Extensive testing and improvement of the Mark I wasn't an option due to the pressure of time, but because the entire project was a secret as well, and the British didn't want to lose their element of surprise by intelligence about the project leaking to the Germans. Eventually, on the 15th of September 1916, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Douglas Haig, couldn't resist and sent several Mark I's into action at Flers during the Battle of the Somme. In reality, he sent in too few, and the tanks weren't improved and tweaked to the extent of forcing a breakthrough. The element of surprise was now gone, and within a few months the Mauser 12.8 mm T-Gewehr, an anti-tank rifle, appeared on the German side. The introduction of tanks at the Western Front was combined with psychological warfare from the side of the British. The first series of male tanks, armed with a 6-pounder naval gun, were numbered starting at 701. The first series of female tanks, armed with multiple machine guns instead of a mix of machine guns and cannons, were numbered starting at 501. This was done in order to pretend there was an entire armada of tanks produced that could easily overrun the German lines at the Western Front. Up to the point of the Mark I engaging in its first battle, the tank was a near boy's dream, developing a technologically supreme bulwark of a weapon in a very short time that may turn the tide of the war. Eventually, after its production, this boy's dream became lost in the bureaucratic nightmare that followed suit once the success of the tank became prevalent. Still, tanks gained considerable successes for the British during the war. On the 20th of November 1917, at the Battle of Cambrai, tanks were utilized and broke through the Hindenburg Line. 7 months beforehand, at the Battle of the Somme, a couple of tanks were put into action and, supported by 6 divisions, demolished the barbed wire fences put up and rolled over the German trenches. The British captured 10,000 German prisoners of war and 200 cannons that day. It was an uncommon success, and the only time during the entire war the bells rang in London to celebrate the victory. In 1918, the Mark IV was developed and came into action. It was a much improved version of the Mark I from 2 years previous. The tank was resistant to anti-tank ammunition and could be operated by 1 person instead of 4, as was the case with the Mark I. The French had developed their own Renault tank with a rotating turret on top, and even the Germans managed to construct their own A7V, the only tank produced by Germany in World War I, to be used in combat, as the German High Command focused more on anti-tank weaponry. And to end on a positive note, though Churchill was dismissed earlier in the war, Prime Minister David Lloyd George remarked after the news of the usage of tanks reached England, "It is really to Mr. Winston Churchill that the credit is due, more than to anyone else. He took up with enthusiasm the idea of making them a long time ago, and he met with many difficulties." It would be characteristic of Churchill's entire career that he would always follow his own path, against odds, but that's a story for another time, a very fascinating one, might I add. Thank you very much for watching this video. And what is a development or event in military history that you would like to know more about and perhaps see a video of? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to this channel. See you next time.